So for those of you who were not there in the morning, I'm Siri Gloppen. I've been collaborating with Namita and her team on this report, not on the project rather, for the last 5 years. I'm director of the Center on Law and Social Transformation and the head of the project on the Norwegian side. So I'm really, really thrilled to be here, and I'm really impressed by the report and the discussion in the first panel, and I look forward to this second part. And because we don't have much time and everybody has so much to say, I just wanted to start with the first panelist, which is Dr. Sharan Babu, who's the senior fellow at CPR, and who has been working a lot on the Dalit issues. And of course, as has already been discussed, the scheduled castes and the Dalits have, in a way, done better with the special legal provisions in many ways than the scheduled tribes, although in some ways the rights, and particularly to land, of the scheduled tribes are stronger. So you've been asked to say something about this, how this looks from the Dalit perspective and from all your research on Dalit legal empowerment. So I give the word to you.
So, thank you very much, and congratulations. Very well-informed experts complimented you, and I have seen how hard it was for you to compile this report. I would bump into you once in a while. You're so downcast because you couldn't figure out a particular area, whether it is a scheduled area or not. So, thank you for. This is the kind of work CPR is known for. We are really proud of you. And Namita has given me a very specific task, as mentioned, to talk about in the context of Dalits. Even though both the communities, scheduled tribes and scheduled castes, are scheduled way back in 1935, and their trajectories have somewhat taken two different paths altogether. But there are similarities also. Why is that? But before I answer those specific questions, I would like to make a couple of comments. By the way, there is nothing prescriptive in my comments. It's only my personal views I'm expressing, because I'm not that much familiar with the condition of the scheduled tribes. One is we always praise the constitutional scheme as very revolutionary and pro-tribal. I would like to start where Dr. Haq ended the panel, asking that question. Why is it that governors and President of India, having so much power, have never used those special powers? Take the case of governor's special powers. A governor can suspend or completely stop the operation of any state law or central law if he feels that that particular law would adversely affect tribals in the scheduled areas. We all praise this, but isn't it bombastic and very, very unrealistic? Governor being the agent of president, he works as agent of the president, and president himself is expected to do his job on the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers, which passes a law in Parliament intent on implementing it. How any governor can do that? By the way, it is very easy to dismiss a governor, but not a government employee. Governor has no tenure, even those 5 years, it's more a tradition. It's on the at the pleasure of the president. There were occasions in the past, governors were just dismissed. So having a provision which has no utility is worse than not having it, because it gives us false hope. You go to any seminar, especially people from the government would come and say, these are the kind of provisions Indian Constitution grants to the both SCs and STs. So there are maybe problems here and there in terms of implementation, but that's not the case. The very scheme itself is either not I would say it's unrealistic. There are several provisions in the Constitution. Our founding fathers put them there with a lot of hope that the future generations would be at least competent to sincere in implementing that. And another problem with the constitutional scheme is, after 1935 Act, the British government created a diarchy here, where the elected ministers in the provinces will end up having all the responsibilities, but the bureaucrats will have the powers, like financial powers. So if you see all the scheme, like National Commission for SCs and STs, special powers of the governors, they only have the responsibility. Take a case of an atrocity on tribals or Dalits. First day news comes, the National Commission sends a delegation. Their job is to provide some ex gratia payment or some financial assistance to the victims. They have no control over the police. Even though they have investigative powers, they can have, I think, deputy DSPs. But those posts are still remain vacant. So this is the same diarchy we put in place, where the institutional arrangements to protect the rights of tribals end up having all these responsibilities, but they have no power to actually implement them. When was the last time any government consulted any of the national commissions, either for SCs or STs, when they are coming up with a policy, they are supposed to consult these commissions? It never happened. So I have a problem with the very constitutional scheme itself. The second is a very collapse of general administration, especially in the tribal areas. What was the need for an Atrocities Act in 1989, which is called draconian and is very effective? When police don't do their job, you are passing a special law and expecting the same police to implement this. Those who don't implement your IPC and your CRPC, you expect them to implement this particular law. I don't see any reason how they would do that. So we have a scheme which is in the air somewhere. The ground reality is completely different. And this applies to both SCs and STs. But why is it that in the case of Dalits, you see some development? I would say the chief difference is Dalits are being plains people. They can access general resources and institutions, like educational institutions, healthcare, the same road built in a city used by the non-Dalits and Dalits. That is not the case with the tribals. They are completely isolated. Why there is so much difference in the narrative? Dalits have one leader, Dr. Ambedkar. Under his name, you can assemble thousands of Dalits at a short notice, any place. It doesn't mean that it's a monolithic community. You have about 600 tribes in entire India. If you see Dalit caste, they're much more. It doesn't mean that they have unity, but at least they are united, one, because they are the victims of untouchability. Number two, they have a leader who is relevant yesterday, today. If you see yesterday's Mint, somebody wrote an article talking about how Ambedkar's views on agrarian distress are still valid. So they have some role model which motivates them. Unfortunately, I would say this is the much more glaring failure of our system, that we could not create even a small, very articulate intelligentsia or bourgeoisie among tribals. You see all the politicians from the tribal communities, the way they come into the system, not on their own. I'm 100% sure there are very competent and articulate tribal leaders, but political parties do not allow them. So that is one significant difference. And what tribals can learn from Dalits' struggles? I would say no need to learn from others. If we improve general administration, I don't want all these special laws. If an atrocity takes place, if I go to the police station, if the constable does his job, the tribal can take care of himself. The real problem is that is not happening. You have, I thought the rehabilitation issues are settled. Even in Polavaram, it is not done. 24 years back, I visited Colombo. My friend took me outside the city to a small irrigation project. As a typical Indian, I asked him what happened to the displaced people. He looked strangely at me and said that before we started the construction, we settled them and then only we started the construction. So even in our own neighborhood, these things happen, but why it doesn't happen in India? So improving general administration will enable tribals to chart their own course. I don't even accept this integration and isolation debate. We never asked that question ourselves. I decide which part of my identity I would like to keep, which part of that I barter away. My mother tongue is something different. I'm speaking in a different language because that's my choice. Nobody imposed it on me. But that cannot be said in the context of tribals. We are not giving them the agency to decide which model they want to accept or what is the kind of trade-off they would like to have on their own free will and volition. And lastly, I talk about we did this work on Dalit entrepreneurs. Probably this is maybe controversial for you. Who succeeded as entrepreneurs? Those who don't have land, those who don't have education. Third, those who were willing to move. I do understand the logic of land rights. Unless you are a big farmer, land is a trap. It's almost a graveyard. Having a small piece of land would tie the family to the village. It's always subsistence life. They can't move. The moment you don't have land, at least one generation will suffer, move to a city, into a slum. There is a chance of improvement. That's what we noticed with regard to Dalit entrepreneurs. People who moved into a place like Pune, few years as a rickshaw puller, then auto driver, slowly moved into different things. There are very few cases I'm talking about, so there, we don't know how many failed. But at least there is a route here. That can happen only if we don't really insist on land or identify those tribal entrepreneurs, which we are going to do very soon, how they got into the entrepreneurship and how we can scale it up as a model. That's what we did with regard to the Dalit entrepreneurs, to tell the community that these are the opportunities. You don't have to look upon the government for affirmative action and all those benefits. There can be several ways you can take care of yourself and you have agency. That's what I would say.
Thank you. That is very interesting. So thanks a lot. Our next speaker you've already heard from, Dr. Sastry, was the former director of the Tribal Cultural Research and Training Institute in Andhra Pradesh and has researched these issues for almost 5 decades. And it's has been extremely useful and helpful to the project from the very start. So, and you can speak on all the issues, so you have to choose a few. And I know that Namita in particular wanted to hear why tribal mobilization at the political level has been so limited. So what's the way forward?
Fifth scheduled area administration is, there are so many problems that cannot be discussed within a small time. But I will flag only 2 or 3 important issues within the time allotted to me. One is that, incidentally, it is in this month of March in 1968, I passed out of Andhra University in MA Anthropology, and now I am in the 50th year of my research career in tribal areas. All these years, from the beginning, I have been asking my colleagues seniors, and later on I started telling others also. Is it really possible for the governor to implement a protective legislation against the overall socio-political environment? That is one issue. Initially, maybe when the constitution was drafted, the overall political, socio-political environment is a socialist pattern of society, egalitarian society, and there was a lot of chance for implementing all these issues under fifth schedule. Later on, as we moved to 1980s, the society is opened up, liberalization process have stepped in, and more aggressively in the last 2 decades. So when this has come, the overall social, economic, political environment has such a overwhelming impact on the functioning of the society. The tribals have been automatically marginalized, and there is nobody to hear their voice also. Sometimes they become violent. There are some passive measures. After that, they are forgotten. The second issue that has been flagged to me by Dr. Namita is that about the leadership in tribal areas. Why the leadership is not able to deliver whatever they are expected for the tribals. Recently, I have been to one of the districts, Adilabad district, where there is a big conflict between aboriginal tribals and the newly recognized tribal group, which has slowly cornering all the benefits meant for the aboriginal tribals. Especially in Andhra Pradesh, the governor has given a special notification using his powers under fifth schedule that 100% of the posts of teachers are reserved to the local tribals. Similarly, he has given notifications for about 50 and odd. In 1986, when this notification came, out of 1,200 teachers appointed in that district, 1,100 are from the aboriginal tribes only. I was the assistant project officer working there. When the conflict came last month, I was called there saying that as if I can solve the problem, but they had some faith. When I took out the details, in the last 4 years, 785 teachers' posts were filled, and out of that, only 60 are aboriginal tribes. Others are tribes, they don't belong to the scheduled area, but they created some fake tribal certificates, fake agency certificates, and got it. And who gave these certificates, how they managed, how they think, I just say it's a big law and order problem. Again, when these resources have become scarce, whoever is aggressive, he is able to get it, and the aboriginals are, and the local leadership. The member of parliament is from the aboriginal tribe, member of legislative assembly is from the aboriginal tribe. And then, because of my familiarity, I asked them, why you are keeping quiet? He said, my party doesn't like me to speak independently. Because in this election process in the recent years, even though it's a reserved constituency, the scheduled tribe member of parliament, member of legislative assembly, or even the sarpanch of a gram sabha, sarpanch of a gram panchayat, is being sponsored on political lines. So their affiliation or their loyalty is more to the party than to the local community. Even though the member of parliament, I know him when he was a teacher, he is a highly educated teacher, MA, MED in those days. I'm talking of 1980s when he was a headmaster. And he himself is a minister of tribal welfare in one term, now member of parliament. He says, I have all the sympathies for my fellow Aboriginal tribals, but I cannot help them because the overall political this is in favor of the community, is also a tribal community, is in favor of that community which is dominant, and their votes are important to the ruling party. And when we took out the statistics, out of 30 lakh tribal population in Telangana now, after the formation, 20 lakh belong to one tribal community, and the next highest is a Gond tribal community of 5 lakhs. That is the difference. But in this Adilabad district, Gonds and Aboriginal tribals are 80%. This particular community is only 20%. 20% of the community cornering 80% of benefits, and 80% community cornering 20%. This, even though an order has been given by the governor, and the last point, if you give me one more minute, I will not encroach in others' time. Last point is why the district collector as agent to government is not able to act. In case of Polavaram, again I will repeat, the district collector is also land acquisition officer. So he is more pressurized as a land acquisition officer than an agent, because the people do not pressurize him to perform the duties of agent. But the contractor under Polavaram pressurizes him to go ahead with land acquisition, this and that, all kinds of. Now there is a big conflict there because 275 villages are going to be submitted tomorrow or day after tomorrow, and there was no discussion with the people. No place has been selected for rehabilitation, and what is going to these people, God only knows. That's where I stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sastre. Very interesting and useful perspectives. Thank you. We've been talking a lot about, or hearing a lot about, the law not working. So I think it's very appropriate that our next speaker is a lawyer who's a litigating lawyer, presenting cases to the Delhi High Court, to the Supreme Court, and who has been working extensively with issues around indigenous rights, tribal rights, and so on, not only as in court, but also through research. So, we'd love to hear your thoughts on how the law can be sort of improved in its working, and also how you see the discourses in India in a more international perspective. So, I forgot to say your name. So it's Shomona Khanna. I'm not sure if I pronounced it rightly.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. I realize that you have a lot of expectations from me, but I'm part of the team working on this issue. So I mean team in the larger sense. So I'm also struggling all the time with trying to grapple with some of these issues. I think I have a small complaint with Namita. If you'd given me a little more time to prepare, I probably would have come better prepared, but then I wouldn't have stopped speaking after 10 minutes. So maybe it just works out fine. So just a couple of thoughts that I have on the report while I was reading it. Actually, there are two key things that I would like to talk about today. One of the things that I think in the panel we heard in the morning, there was some mention about how important it is to refer to Article 21 of the Constitution, the right to life. And I would actually go a little further and say that it's important for us to talk about Article 14, 15, 16, 17, the right to equality, and try to locate the constitutional provisions, the statutory provisions, and all the work that we're doing in terms of how we articulate our arguments in our day-to-day work, plus also how we articulate our advocacy with the government and also inside the courtroom to constantly make a reference to the right to equality. How am I saying that? that this is not something that I've come up with myself. This is something which is actually, I think, probably first mentioned in the Samta judgment, where the court talked about the historical injustice against tribal communities in terms of their severance from their natural resources, from their lands, from the kind of oppression that they faced in development and so on and so forth. And it talked about how the provisions in the constitution which provide special status or what we would call affirmative action are actually part of the aspiration of our constitution and of our nation towards equality. And this is something that is described in our jurisprudential literature as substantive equality. And so I think that it really, really helps at a conceptual level if we think of the 5th schedule, the 6th schedule, the various provisions that are there under the Land Acquisition Law, the Forest Rights Act, PESA, and multiple other legislations which protect people's rights, tribals' rights over resources, forest dwellers' rights, as part of the constitutional design. And I always think of it like that. It really helps me, and it really helps in terms of articulating the argument when we are trying to make it in court. Having said that, it's also important to recognize the reality that we live in a judicial system, a system of state, where at the heart of the problem is eminent domain, which Namita pointed to this morning also. And I think in many of our work, we realize this, that the notion of eminent domain, the fact that the state is sovereign over all resources and all land, even over private land and private property, is something that lies at the heart of the problem. So what are we then talking about? I mean, we're basically talking about a legal system which is, or even not just a legal system, a political system that is, providing us with these contradictions and these paradoxes. And I don't want to get into sort of a debate on politics and so on, but I think what you've done in the report it really drew my attention to the fact that as the constitution from the 1919 Government of India Act to the 1935 Act to the Constituent Assembly debates and then the constitution in its form at 1950s and how it's evolved over time, is that it's constantly trying to deal with these contradictions. And these are inherent contradictions in a system where we're trying to deal with democracy, and we're trying to bring about a system where there is equality, fairness, justice in a society that is deeply divided, and there are very entrenched forms of discrimination and injustice in our system. One of the things that really strikes me is that, and I think I did raise this at the last meeting that we met, I think to discuss a preliminary version of this report, was that around the 1990s is when liberalization happened in India. And you see from the 1990s and towards the turn of the millennium for sure, there is a sort of, there's this fatigue. Even we have stopped bringing up the issue of the welfare state. And the fact that the state is supposed to perform these welfare functions, I definitely notice in the work that we do that it's become tiring to say it. The state is supposed to provide health care, which is quality health care, and then you have a news report of somebody whose leg has been amputated and his leg is, used as a pillow under his head. So this, it's so exhausting to talk about these simple things in a time like this, but it's important to recognize that a lot of the constitutional and the legal provisions, the statutory provisions that were put in place were in 1950 or 1952 at a time when it was envisioned as a socialist state. And therefore, you were trusting the state to do the right thing. And therefore, there are all these, whether you look at the Minerals Act, the Land Acquisition Act, and the whole notion of public purpose, and a lot of the constitutional provisions, and even the notion of eminent domain being part of the fundamental rights chapter in Article 31A, B, C, etc., is that we were really trusting the state to do the right thing. Today, we are confronted with the reality where the state and large capital have joined forces to to a completely new system. We are still trying to understand what does this mean. In a recent meeting we were talking about what is our notion of state in today's reality. What is the state supposed to do in today's reality? It's in this larger context that I'm looking at the Forest Rights Act and the PESA and also certain provisions of the new LARR that have come. And it's also, Siri didn't say this, but for 4 years I was the legal consultant for the Ministry of Tribal Affairs, and my term came to an end last year. It was a very interesting experience because I actually got to live inside this contradiction. And this sort of, you know, the Ministry of Tribal Affairs having its mandate to look after and to protect and defend the constitutional and statutory rights of tribal communities across the country, and being very much located inside a government where it is, in terms of you know, you name it, in terms of power, in terms of the kind of office space that is provided, to the kind of, you know, the fact that a lot of the people who are posted there look at it as a punishment posting, to the fact that, you know, the offices are distributed between 3 different locations in Delhi, so carrying files from here to there when you need to have a meeting in an important emergency situation means, you know, like a transport crisis for the people who are working in the ministry. So just during that time, it was such a crisis to deal with a lot of these things. But I think that what I found very interesting was that in spite of all that, the officers that were posted inside the ministry at that particular time somehow managed to understand what their role was. And somehow we managed to defend the Forest Rights Act against a number of different kinds of challenges that arose. I'll just give you one small example, which it's not a small example actually. It's the whole concept of Gram Sabha consent for the purposes of forest diversion. So I think we spent 1.5 years pretty much behind closed doors and outside the public eye, just simply firefighting, because it was just the little tribal ministry and its little officers in the middle and surrounded by all the other sort of more powerful, more better funded, better resource ministries, and the Ministry of Tribal Affairs sort of continuously saying that no, this is the correct interpretation of the Forest Rights Act, and we're going to stick to our guns. And I think that till such time as the ministry was able to stick to those guns, it managed. But then after a point of time, what you all have noticed, like just now Maharashtra has issued an order saying for linear projects is not required. But through all those times, I think that what really helped us was to constantly keep referring to the constitutional foundations. The whole concept of historical injustice and linking it to the right to equality really helped in articulating the arguments, because if we did not have that articulation, then we would have not been able to survive the kind of challenge that would come repeatedly literally on a daily basis, that do a word search inside the Forest Rights Act and find the word consent. Where is it written? It's written in section 4.2, which is to do with critical wildlife habitats. It's got nothing to do with forest diversion. So I think that you know, there is a lot of space within the law, and maybe because I'm a lawyer and I happen to be a practicing lawyer who hasn't yet abandoned that practice, to say that yes, there is space and we need to continue to fight to protect that space. And I think that we should also take the fact that there are contradictions in our stride. The fact that there are contradictions with extant laws, such as the Indian Forest Act still recognizes encroachments on forest land or reserve forest land as a criminal offense. This is a contradiction. The Forest Rights Act says they're right holders who are going to now, as a community, decide how that forest is to be managed. The Indian Forest Act says that you are criminals. So let's take these contradictions in our strides and recognize them for what they are. They are a space for us to actually articulate what we think. And I think that sometimes what happens is that when we sort of surrender that space due to, you know, whatever sense of dismay or a sense of defeat or a sense of, you know, this is just too much, then what happens is the kind of thing that has happened on the 7th of March with the Supreme Court order. I don't know how many of you are aware, I'm just finishing, that the Supreme Court has passed an interim order in a batch of petitions relating to the constitutional validity of the Forest Rights Act, where the Union of India was careful to adopt a litigation strategy, a new litigation strategy, which is called default mode, according to me. And nobody was present in the court. Then a lot of the tribal rights organizations, because they're constantly under state of pressure, so they just happened not to have reached the court in time on that particular day. So the people who are challenging the constitutional validity of the FRA took full advantage, fed a whole lot of garbage to the court and got the court to pass an interim order saying that if rights have not been recognized or claims have been rejected of those people, then by definition, they're encroachers and therefore they should have been evicted. So the state governments should now file affidavits to show what they have done to evict people whose claims have been rejected. Now this is the kind of order that gets passed when we go into default mode. And I think that it's very wrong for us to you know, we need to recognize that there are problems, and I think that those have been pointed out very beautifully in your report and also in the discussions we've had in the morning and also now. Definitely we are up against a really strong and a large number of very powerful forces. Many of them are entrenched inside our constitution itself. But inside that same constitution are also the contradictions on which we can ride. And I think we need to take full advantage of that. Yeah, I think I'll just close here.
Thank you so much. Very, very interesting. Our last two speakers today, who will be presenting together, are Dr. Shredar and Mr. Rana Sengupta. And Dr. Shredar has also been very important advisor and interlocutor throughout the whole duration of the project. He's the managing trustee of Environics Trust and the former chairperson of Mines, Minerals and People, which is, I think, the main capacity in which you've been speaking today, which brings together a lot of organizations working on rights of people engaged in mining and so on. And Dr. Shredar has, for more than 30 years, been working with communities on environmental and alternative technology issues, network building, doing research, and also providing support for human rights and environmental litigation. And Mr. Rana Sengupta has been working with cooperatives of stone quarry workers to protect and advance their rights to environment, safety, welfare, and social security. So we're really interested in hearing what you think about the report and particularly the issues around displacement and so on. So.
Thank you, Siri, and thank you, Namita, and thanks for what I would call as an excellent baseline for further research and looking at what can be done in future. But the kind of things that are happening today, I get a feeling that the Constitution of India and many of the protective laws and the reality, you know, totally divergent. So while many of us like to believe that we are a right-based society, and with proper law, and our government, particularly the state, when it goes out of the country, keeps on emphasizing that we are a large democracy, we have lots of rights, and we have a working court system, all those kinds of things. But when it actually does work, it treats as if it's a right-burdened society. So like if you see the conversations, they say that the environmental law is a hurdle for development. For tribal law is a hurdle for development. Even bureaucrats and politicians say that pesa ke naam mein you are stopping development. So what we consider as a right, what I think the Indian state particularly is a very, very cunning state. As one of my friend, she has been writing about, anthropologist Shalini Randeria. It's a very cunning state. It has got a plethora of laws. It knows what to use when. And also, we are going through an era where I would say that this is an inherent race to the bottom. It's a very, very inherent race to the bottom. The way you are seeing, states after states begging for investment melas, the kind of, everyone competing with each other, saying that I've got $1 billion more than you as commitments to finance. And therefore, I find that, constitution, law, probably not only in India, across the world, have no longer any meaning. If you have money, then the process starts. So, investment has become the key purpose for which, anything is molded. And therefore, I call this an era of invited imperialism, invited corporate imperialism. So you invite people and say, please take my land. I'll give you at no cost, or low cost or no cost. I'll get rid of people for you. I'll get rid of all other laws. Because I don't think anything can be more transparent than the point I raised earlier, when the Prime Minister's website, it says that you give 75 million if you have an anticipated investment, not actually investing also, because most of those corporates actually don't invest, they only take it out of our banks. So if you have an anticipated investment of $75 million, if you are a foreign investor, and if you have $150 million of Indian investment, the Prime Minister's office is willing to change policies and laws for you. So we are in such a kind of a situation today. And thanks to people like Shamona and a bunch of lawyers, the last of survival is being hung around by constant litigation in courts, in constant appeals at the administrative level. At one point of time, like in the morning, Ravi was mentioning, in the 80s at least, we could seek some administrative justice. There were tall officers who'd refuse to do things if they were against people. But slowly that era has gone. Now, there is no scope. You can file petitions after petitions to the collector, but the collector will try and turn a blind eye, or he'll just wait for the day that he is going to be transferred. So the whole process of administrative justice has gone, and therefore the only way people are currently trying to delay this process of, inevitable displacement and, is just that, there are few legal kind of holds on which we are still functioning. So this whole financialization and, investment-driven era of development is, completely eroding the entire, constitutional and legal basis of our living. And what we are finding is that the people who are going to bear this brunt largely are the tribals. As a lot of people in the morning said, it's a very diverse group of indigenous communities in India. So it's not that they can suddenly join together and do a very big rally in Delhi. But with the kind of direction our state is going, that also doesn't make much of a difference, because we have seen farmers in thousands, waiting for any senior decision maker to be met in Delhi, and the government simply refusing to meet them, whether it was farmers from Tamil Nadu or other farmers, and we now saw lots of farmers walking more than 200 kilometers to Mumbai. So when the powerful farmers themselves have very little say in what is happening, whether it is land or their seed or whatever it is, then to think of that there will be protection for the tribals, I think we are fooling ourselves, right? Unless there is location by location, people are fighting. People fought in Niyamgiri. They stood their ground. Once they stood their ground, there were lots of other national, global, other kind of support that I think the inevitable has been delayed now. But that same protection did not give it to Karlapat or Kodingamali or the Samata judgment gave protection to the tribals in Andhra, but across the state in Chhattisgarh, where can you have anything more disgusting than this, that a National Mineral Development Corporation with an expenditure of 3,000 crores earns 15,000 crores, and what do you give back to the people are some IED proof tanks to shoot them down. This is what they get back in as the profits that they provide to you. What is in return that they get is only this. So my own personal feeling is, when I read the Constitution and the preamble and whatever changes in the preamble which came up, which says we are a socialist, secular, democratic republic, I think actually has turned out today to be a capitalist, communal, semi-feudal, corporate oligarchy. And, no, it's like the dream of this, the dream of a socialist, secular, democratic republic has been led astray. And we are a capitalist, communal, semi-feudal, corporate oligarchy. And that is why, one could bulldoze, saying that I will have a Delhi-Mumbai industrial corridor. If you see the recent Haryana High Court judgment, Supreme Court judgment on Haryana, you use the law. How do you use the law? You say that I'm going to notify Section 4 of Land Acquisition Act, and I am going to issue a notice for 900 hectares. So immediately people are in distress. They say what to do. I'll get only 1 lakh rupee for this compensation. So there are then the companies which come, and they buy off land at 2 lakhs and 3 lakhs and 4 lakhs. And then the government says, no, I'm withdrawing that. I plan to withdraw this notification. Now you have lost your land. Then now the Supreme Court also says, but the intent was the urban development and the industrial development, and therefore now even if the people have been cheated, outrightly cheated, and the Supreme Court accepts that they have been outrightly cheated, the land will come back to the Haryana government. So which is a proxy again for the industry. So I strongly believe that unless we are constantly telling the rulers today that please restore our confidence in the Constitution by not behaving but don't misbehave with the Constitution, and take us this path. Because before I close, I have to say that all this that has been acquired, this 34 stranded thermal power plants today, 13 gas-based power plants today, several steel plants today, which have taken Adivasi lands, Now, what is the fate of them? Now, here is a guy who takes up land, and skims off the capital, and then he comes and says, I owe 10,700 crores to the bank. I have gone bankrupt. So his brother-in-law comes and says, no, the net worth of the company is now 2,500. I'll give you 3,000 crores. And how do you, when the National Company Law Tribunal asks him, how will you finance that? He says, I'll put in 125 crores, but because I am credit worthy, I'm going to get another 2,500 crores from the bank. And now, with nothing at all, we'll give them this. So it is not only the land, the rights of the tribals, but also our money that we are giving. And that's why I call, in this era of the rule of this, capitalist, communal, semi-feudal, corporate oligarchy, we not only give our land and give up our resources, but we are also giving our money, and therefore it is this invited corporate imperialism that we are drawing to ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Namita ji, for inviting. Actually, I heard her first time few months back in a meeting in Delhi, and then the presentation was like was trying to draw my attention that there's such important data in that particular presentation, and what are we doing about it? So I was waiting. I was trying to call her several times that I want that data. So, in reference to mining, because there were 2-3 issues that are related to this particular subject, that is dams and mining, and the third one I don't recall right now. But yeah, my experience and my work is constrained and restricted to mine workers only. So I'll give you share some examples where mine workers or the communities, affected communities, come from. So whether it is a scheduled area or a non-scheduled area, mining always has been a foreign subject for the local communities. They don't do mining. They work as mine workers to the maximum. They don't get a share out of whatever is being extracted. All they get is occupational diseases or displacement or something like that, which is not in a positive side. So we were trying to organize mine workers demanding their rights, which we failed miserably, because on individual capacities, they can't. They'll be kicked out from wherever they're asking for. So we started organizing them. We first referred to the rules, which says that preferential rights for mining is given to scheduled caste, scheduled tribe people. And then when we saw how many leases were given to scheduled tribe and scheduled caste people, so they were given, but they were all proxy. So somebody else was operating it. So here again, there is a foreign person who is doing the mining on behalf. So how do we do it? So we organize them to form cooperatives, because at individual capacities they can't mine. So we formed cooperatives and applied for mining leases. So government made a provision, made an amendment in their rules, and they set a preferential rights for cooperatives, but not for mine workers cooperatives, unemployed mining engineers. Okay. So we thought that now they have changed the rule in their own interest and not for the communities. So after few years, we realized that they have washed away all those provisions, and they have come up with a new act or new amendment which says here onwards only auction will work. No leasing, no preferential rights, only auction. That is one instance which I'll mention how now we are using that against the government. Second is the asbestos mines in Udaipur region. They were closed because of Supreme Court orders. And then it was a death trap for all the livestock and small children in that area, because mining was not happening, but the pits are still there. So these tribal communities organized themselves and asked under the NREGA to reclaim those abandoned pits. So we investigated how do we go, and job cards were filled, applications were filed. But finally we found that the response from the Jilla Pramukh or the authority which is supposed to sanction, they said that that land is not with us. That land is with the mining department. And the mining department says that we don't mine. So the whole thing is, when this was applied for mining, approval was taken from the panchayat to do mining. But when mining was stopped, the land was not given back to the panchayat. So till today, the land stands with the mining department, and the communities, the tribal communities who wanted to restore the land, they couldn't. So this is a second example of what happens with workers who are trying to organize themselves to do mining. They don't get preferences. If they don't want to do mining and use the land for something else, still they don't have a right on the land. And then comes with the latest development with the DMFT, District Mineral Foundation Trust. Last week, Sridharji and we all were there at Jaipur, we were discussing. And there also, I was reflecting to Namitaji's presentation of tribal communities and their rights over resources and the land. So with the new rule also, there is no preferences, no giving back to the communities, though there are no preferential rights for sharing the resources of the DMFT with the tribal communities. So till date also the government doesn't want to. So what is it that is happening? So I heard a word which was known as political will. So if there is no political will, so that won't happen. So from the perspective of mine workers, the fundamental thing which we are deprived of is an identity. We don't have any identity in the state that we are workers. Despite that 10,000 mine workers have been identified suffering from silicosis, and some 5,000 of them have been paid monetary relief. But not a single case under workman compensation has been filed in the state for the last 15 years. So if you can't establish your identity, you can't fight for your own rights, whether you're talking about your economic rights, social rights, or your land rights, or the rights of the local community over the mineral resources, whether they are the villagers, dwellers, or the mine workers in the same village. So we had two suggestions with the government. One is, so if you remember, somebody was saying that in the meeting, that their village is affected because of regular blasting happening, and the mining department was sitting in the panel. The grievances were heard, and the mining department said that, see, we give mining leases. We don't give this explosive licenses. So you better go to that department who gives explosive license. But that department doesn't monitor the problem which is happening. So it's a complex nature, whether it is land, whether it is tribal rights, whether it is labor, whether it is explosives. But the thing which is happening is mining. And why we are not able to bring a solution to it is just because the right of extracting or the power of giving extraction leases is with the mining department, which is the only body which can close mining other than the court. So that department has no interest of closing the mining activity. So when we are saying about mining activity, the biggest lacuna is with the policy. At the central level and the state level, we have a mineral policy, which the mining department is protecting. We don't have a mining policy. If we have a mining policy, then I think they'll take all the factors in, whether it is tribal rights, whether it is welfare, whether it is indigenous communities' rights, whether it is sharing of resources. So the activity is mining, but what we are talking about is only mineral extraction. And that is why they had a right and they had the power to say that we'll only auction the leases. You people don't have any right, whether we decide whether we are going to give preferential rights or we are going to give auction rights. So we came up with two strong recommendations on which we are doing a political lobby now, because there is no political will. One is come up with a mining policy, integrated mining policy. Second, if you can auction leases, then we are 75 lakh workers in this state. We will auction our votes. So whether it is the ruling party or the opposition party, whoever wants to come into power in the next session, please come and bid for our votes. Bring up a mine workers welfare board, and we are there to vote you. So that is what, because in Rajasthan, if you come to the civil lines, there are two houses. One is the CM houses and there's the ex-CM houses. The only thing is they shift from one building to the other building overnight. Okay, so now it is the BJP government. They have few months, and next is the Congress government. Okay, so whoever is going to bid for our votes, we are there to give them the votes and ensure the welfare of the mine workers. We have a planner, this year's planner, which is basically trying to say that we are there to sell ourselves. I give a thanks to all the organizers and give you for calling me and giving me an opportunity to. Thank you.